Yeah, it's not there yet, Corella. It was, and it disappeared. There we go.
Right, next slide. Right, can we all see that?
Yes.
Yeah, fantastic. So my name's Peter Worth. I'm the Community Funding Officer at West Northants Council. These are the methods how to contact me. That's my email address, my telephone number if you're interested in grant funding. And also we offer an online expression of interest form if you are thinking about funding. I will come on to that later on during this presentation, but if you are thinking about grant funding, it's worth filling that out sooner rather than later. I'll explain the reasons why as we go through the presentation. Next slide, please. So today we're going to cover the grants that are available during 21-22 and 22-23, who can apply for those grants, what the community funding grant policy contains, which is quite an important document to read before you apply for grant funding, because that explains what you need to demonstrate as an applicant, particularly paragraph 3.3, what we will and will not fund, how to apply, what the process is, a little bit about how we assess these applications and make determinations, and an actual slide that shows the process steps of how we actually do all of this. Next slide, please. So at the moment, there are 4 main grants available. Direct grants, which we use to commission services. So these are like the big community transport projects that we fund, the advice services like Citizens Advice Bureau, those that run over a number of years. So we'll fund mainly a project or service to run for 2 or 3 years. There are the criteria for getting into the direct grants. The Star Fund, which is supporting those at risk. This was a particular element of public health money that we used to support local organisations that were supporting those most at risk. So the food charities, some of the homeless charities. The Councillors' COVID Support Fund, which was an amount given to each ward councillor to distribute within their ward. And the Community Funding Grant Scheme. So the only 2 that are open at the moment are the Councillors' COVID Support Fund, and that is coming to an end because most of them have spent their allowances now, and the Community Funding Grant. So I'm really going to concentrate mainly on the Community Funding Grants today. Next slide. So in order to apply for a community funding grant, you have to be a registered charity, a community or voluntary group, a club, a community interest company, or a not-for-profit company. Oh, we've jumped on a little bit there. So, and you have to operate within the geographical boundaries of West Northants Council. So you could be an organisation that is actually physically located in North Northants, but as long as you provide services to people in West Northants, we would consider you for funding. The policy also contains a list of those organisations that we don't fund, which are the usual groups of people, i.e. private businesses, organisations that run for profit, those that do not have a constitution or just an informal gathering. We also don't fund individuals, and also town and parish councils were excluded from this grant stream. So we no longer fund town or parish councils through the Community Grant Fund scheme. Next slide. So we now come on to what the contents of the community funding policy is, and this is really a must read before you actually even think about applying for filling in an expression of interest form. It really lists the criteria that applicants have to demonstrate in order to be considered for a grant, and I'll take you through each of them now. Number 1 is that you've got to meet one or more of the council's corporate plan priorities, i.e. your project's got to be green and clean, it's got to improve life chances, it's got to help connect communities, thriving villages and towns, have economic development or some robust resource management. Now in reality, because we're mainly funding community and voluntary groups now, it's the top 4 that are key. And I can assure you most, or really all community or voluntary groups will fit into one of the top 4 ones, but the corporate plan breaks that down into more detail, but you will fit into that. So when you fill out your expression of interest forms, one of the things that we do on that introduction conversation is to work out where you actually fit within those corporate plan priorities. Next slide. You've got to be able to demonstrate there's a need for your project or service. So that's either a need that the council already know about, or a need that you're going to make us aware of through your application process. And so, for example, there's an increased demand or development in your area, improved partnership workings between different organisations. There's a strategic aim or objectives of the council that your particular project or service would address. There's a well-being issue, there's an environmental need, there's a ward issue, or something that's been identified by a local councillor as being a potential issue, such as antisocial behaviour or something like that. That would enable us to consider you for a grant application. Next slide. The reach is a factor that we consider on all these grants now. So really that's the type or group of the population that you're hitting. So children, young people, elderly, residents, marginalised groups, but also the volume of those people, because obviously we want to hit as many people within the population as possible. And you've got to have a clear definition of what the issue you're seeking grant funding is seeking to address. So for example, improving well-being, preventing or reducing the impacts of poverty, increasing community participation, crime reduction, increasing physical activity, providing access to green or open spaces. We cover a wide variety of things on there. So it has to have some reach. The next slide. We also want to be able to see that there are sort of tangible outcomes from funding. So you'll need to explain how that grant funding is going to actually impact those within the community. And those outcomes need to be able to be measured by some format. So there needs to be either some form of monitoring in place, some sort of increased participation, some increased activity. So for example, if we fund a local sports club, we want to know that the availability of that sports club is going to increase, more people can actually physically use it. Next slide. The project has to be sustainable. So we're looking for ways that once we've made a grant offer, that grant is, you're not going to keep coming back to us year on year for exactly the same thing, because these grants are now not for annual supporting of services, but they're there for that one-off kicking to get you started up and running, or to enhance a service. So, you know, if you do come to us for funding, we might ask you about your short, medium and long-term financial planning for that service. Or if you're buying an asset, let's say it's playground equipment, whether you've got the capacity to maintain that, because we want to make sure that you're not going to come to us in a few years' time to say that you now need some more money to maintain that individual asset, and that all consents are in place. So if planning permission's required, you've got that to at least outline level. If you're renting the property or the asset, or the landlord has given consent, or the custodian trustees have given consent for that to actually take place, or that you've got the right to occupy the land or the building that you're actually running the project or service on. Next slide. That the council achieves value for money. So that can be the simple process of making sure that you've got your quotes ready before you apply, 3 quotes for anything over £1,000, to making sure that no other providers are actually providing what you're providing in that area as well. So that might be a reason why we may not fund somebody that comes to us, because we already know that there's somebody else that we're funding in the same vicinity, so it's serving the same population, that we're, so we don't have enough funds to fund absolutely everybody. And the added value is obtained from that grant. So there's an increased impact as a result of that funding. So it reduces antisocial behaviour, for example, or it actually physically increases that community use. Next grant. We also like to see evidence that other funding has been considered. So we would normally ask you, as part of the application process, which other funder providers have you approached, whether the parish council is prepared to support you either verbally or through some sort of funds, whether your ward councillor supports your application. We like to see that. And where appropriate, there's an element of self-funding. I know that's quite difficult at the moment, but we just like to see that there's some form of funding or other forms of funding have been considered. Next slide. That we can actually monitor and evaluate the impact of the grant. So that may be from a simple way of just saying, well, we need to see evidence that you've actually incurred the cost and paid for it, the invoices and bank statements, right the way through to feedback and annual or quarterly meetings for the larger projects, or some form of monitoring in place. So we can see that the increased use is actually physically taking place. We do try to keep this as simple as possible to reduce that burden of administration on those being funded. And for the majority of them, it is simply that defrayment, the payment and defrayment of the grant. Next one. We do recognise that cash flow can be an issue, particularly at this point in time. So the policy does enable us to make advance payments, but really only up to 75% of the value of the grant. So we need to make sure that, what you're seeking funding for, you can do that, or in exceptional circumstances, that we've at least got evidence that a purchase order has been placed for the full amount of the grant, and we know that that's going to be paid. So that's the reason for that one. And number 10, Corella, the next slide, that the grant award will either cover 100% of the costs of whatever we're funding, or defined elements within the project or service that you're seeking funding for. So we no longer fund percentages. So we no longer say it's a £50,000 project and we'll fund 10% of that. We like to fund specific items. So the application form does require you to break it down into like a mini budget of saying what you are actually physically funding. And that gives us the option to select the items that we want to fund up to the value of the grant that we want to give. That may be the full amount that you ask for, or it may be a proportion, a part funding amount based on what we've got available and the budget available to do that. And as I say, these grants, they need to be spent within a 12-month period now. We used to let them run for at least 2 years, but we like to see that they're going to be actually completed and in use within 12 months. Any grant not claimed by the anniversary date will be written back. We will take it away from you. But in exceptional circumstances, like the pandemic, for example, or where contractors have let you down, we will roll it over into the next financial year at an agreed date. So for this year, for community funding only, we have 4 funding rounds available. At the moment, we're closed, but we open on the 8th of July for grants up to £5,000. So the way that we're working at the moment under the current policy is that the first round of every financial year will be for grants up to £15,000, followed by 3 rounds of grants up to £5,000. Next grant. So the things that we will fund are quite wide, actually. We fund running costs, operational costs, capital revenue costs, programs or activities that are directly related to the grant application. We fund training, travel, transport costs, hire purchase, venue costs, festival and events, technical assistance, publicity, salaries, and staff costs. At the moment, the majority of the grant claims coming in are for operational costs. Next slide, please. What we do not fund, we do not fund organisations with unexplained high reserves. So we do ask your treasurer or your responsible financial officer to explain why the balances held in the bank accounts are so high. If there is a valid reason, it's not a factor. So for example, if we're funding a village hall and they've got a reserve set aside for a new roof, obviously that's a valid reason for having high reserves, or they've got reserves set aside for contingency in case they're not going to get other forms of grant funding. So operational costs, we will allow for that. But if they're undefined, undisclosed reserves, we would like to know the reason why. We don't fund costs that can be claimed back from elsewhere, like VAT. We don't allow direct payments to be made to individual members of the grant claiming organisation. We don't fund prizes, gifts, we don't fund alcohol, and we don't fund retrospective costs, which is one that we do tend to get a lot of organisations get caught out on, is that they've already started the project before they've actually got the approval from the council to fund, but we don't fund those costs. We only fund things that are, you know, in the a new project. Next slide. So the key thing is when you come to fill out your application that you've got absolutely everything in place, because we don't allow part applications to go forward to the community funding panel for consideration. So for example, if you haven't got your quotes in, unfortunately it can't pass on to the next stage. So, and there is a bit of an issue here, because under the current policy, if something comes in as complete and we deem it not complete, and you can't resubmit for exactly the same project. So if you get turned down because something is missing, it means that you can't reapply again. So it is important that those grant applications are 100% complete. Next slide. So in order to obtain funding, there are two routes. The expression of interest form, which is available on our website. This is an online application form that just asks for some basic contact details. Once your expression of interest form has been filled in and submitted, one of us, mainly me, will contact you to discuss your eligibility for obtaining the grant. We never really turn anybody down unless they're in an ineligible group, but we will give you some indication of how likely you will be to obtain funding. So if it's something that we've never funded in the past, we will explain that, you know, this particular item is not a particular need, want, or requirement that the council wishes to fund, but you still are welcome to make an application, but your results are going to be somewhat limited if you do continue. Or we can do that by not filling out an expression of interest form and just do that over the telephone. So it's a triage process. The main aim is to try and limit the volume of applications that are coming in that will not be successful, and also to save applicants time, because it does take some time to fill out these forms. And if you're definitely not going to be something that we wouldn't consider funding, it's probably not worth going through that process. The joy of filling out an expression of interest really early, though, is it also enables us to link in with some sector specialists. These are officers within the council that know these particular services or know the geographical area where you're working. And it also gives us time to consider other sources of funding. So for example, Section 106 or SIL if we've got any money that's lying around from Public Health or the FA or Sports England, we are quite successful of diverting people onto other streams that are more suitable for them, and they do normally obtain funding once we've gone through that process with them. So I would recommend anybody thinking about a project or particular something that's going to enhance something within the community that's probably that probably Section 106 or SIL could be used for, to fill out the expression of interest as soon as possible. Next slide, please. We are exceptionally strict about the closing dates for applications. We have to do this to be fair to all applicants. So all those people that do have their quotes in, we can't say, oh, well, we'll give you another week to get the quotes in, because we just have to be fair to everybody. And as I said before, we don't accept incomplete applications. So, for example, if it does require planning permission and you haven't got that, you're not really at a position to submit from our point of view. So you'll need to wait for an appropriate round to happen and an appropriate slot for that to be fitted in for the next consideration of the community funding panel. Next slide, please. So on receipt of your application, we will acknowledge it within 7 working days. We will tell you whether it is complete or incomplete and if it can proceed or not. But we may also ask you for additional information, or we may even visit. So it all depends on the nature of your application and what you're actually physically asking for. The complete applications will be judged against that policy. That's why that document is so key, particular paragraph 3.3. And then what then happens is myself and the sector specialists and a cross-party group of members will look at each of these applications and evaluate them. So there's a whole team of people that look at these in order to work out which ones we wish to, cannot fund, and fund against that policy document. So really that policy document is key. Next slide. So these are the steps that you need to go through. First of all, you have to make contact with me, either through telephone call or an expression of interest. Then when the next grant round opens, the appropriate one will send you a link to the online application form. That will enable you to fill in the process. That also enables us for you to ask any questions and link in with any of the sector specialists. Once you submit the application, it's checked for completeness. The applications are then sent to the sector specialist and the thematic specialists. These are people that particularly know about sports, leisure, the arts, for their recommendations. All those applications will then go to the community funding panel, and the community funding panel will consider those at rather lengthy meetings to work out the ones that we can or cannot fund. The panel chair has the final say. So if people disagree, the panel chair will make the final decision, and then the grant letters are either sent or the rejection letters are sent with an explanation about why we can or cannot fund. Next slide. So that's basically our process and what's available at the moment. Are there any questions?
Right, well, thanks, Peter. A very full resume of everything that goes on at funding at West Northants Council. But any questions? I know there was one in the chat there from Alex at Community Foundations. He says, how much can you share how much is actually available per grant round?
We don't actually divide the budget up into that blocks, Sean. What we actually do, we just say the best projects are funded. That's why the £15,000 round is the first in the financial year, because we probably think that the higher value ones are going to meet more of the corporate policy aims than the others. But we do hold back. This is the problem. It's not really a division. It's about holding back And this is the joy again about expressions of interest. If people get them in early enough, we know there's a particular good project coming in down the line that we might want to fund. So we might mean that we may not fund some of the more worthy ones. The triage process actually is creating us a bit of a problem in the fact that they're all worthy projects that get beyond that point. It's
Right.
just the degrees of worthiness after that.
It's not a perfect science, is it?
It's not a perfect science,
I did your
but
job in the past, yes.
yeah.
Okay, I've got Pratima, and then there's another question in the chat from Kate. But first of all, Pratima.
Thanks, Peter, for that. Just a couple of kind of more kind of wider issues. Do you assess how many applications you get from Black community organizations?
We do,
And
yeah.
Okay, so you have a sense of kind of proportionality in terms of allocation, that kind of
We
thing.
do,
So
yeah.
do you have a kind of, if it's a low percentage, do you have a kind of policy of redressing that? It's kind of
Well,
question what, yeah, go on.
we are trying to address a number of things, bearing in mind that we're a fairly new council since we gained unitary status. Things are still settling down. This is not a perfect science, and it probably will never be a perfect science. But one of the things that is on the agenda is to get out to more groups, different groups, and more BAME groups. So, yeah, it is a factor that we take into consideration. The panel take it into consideration, but you are at the end of the day judged against the current policy. That current
Which I
policy
don't think
does,
anybody would have a problem with. Is just that as a council, obviously, if there's disproportionate impact of number of black organizations. So I talk from an NBCT kind of point of view
yeah.
to that. Also, just having made one application previously, I don't know if that's the experience of other people on the group today, but I and many others found the whole process incredibly difficult, for the sake. So I don't know if it's the same process and the same application form, but it was asking for the last 5 years grant. It was also very tailored on capital funding and more parish council, church halls kind of stuff as well. So I don't know if that's changed now. Um,
It is something we are considering changing. I think we're going to abandon. I think part of the problem was the online application form, and we're just in the process of switching back to the paper form because we think the paper form is easier and better to complete. We were, how can I put it? We were sort of railroaded down that line to some degree by the way that the council wants to do the majority of things online, but I think the way that it was designed by our digital team, it didn't quite work or fit, and I think the paper form is a lot better, and I'm almost sure now that we will revert back to the paper form.
And just a final, Sean, if it's okay, just in terms of the corporate priorities you apply, of course, I understand they're they're the ones to kind of stick to, but they're incredibly broad. So it does make me question how the assessment happens around what are
Yeah,
very broad priorities, and they're not even subheadings against each. So just kind of how does that?
they are incredibly broad, but as the strategies of the council are approved, they're making them more defined. So it does actually say in the policy document that the all applications are judged against the corporate priorities and local and the strategic aims and objectives of the council. More of those are coming into play, so that will be linked into that process at that point in time. Although they're not formally available at the moment, obviously the people that are assessing them are aware of what those priorities are. So, you know, they know that they're there and that's the criteria that they're being judged against.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Pratima. I've got some questions in the chat there. In fact, I think Matthew's question picks up on Pratima's, or Pratima picked up on Matthew's there, in terms of the challenges in applying and feedback from some groups saying that it wasn't easy to complete the forms. and that those groups are often the hardest to engage, which picks up on Pratima's point, I think, somewhere at some time as well. So, and I get the sense from you that it is a work in progress, and that
it is work in process,
and that you know, you'll be taking those things on board to see how you can support groups ever better in the process. There's a question from Kate about, do you need 3 quotes for training, or do you accept 1 quote based on a specific training program being the right one for the organisation?
Yeah, if it's a preferred supplier, obviously there's got to be a justification for that preferred supplier, but we will accept 1 quote, obviously, in that situation. So, or if it's a sole supplier, then obviously we can only accept 1 quote. So, okay. Yes.
Thank you. Okay, Pratima, you've still got a hand up though. Is that another question, or you just got to lower the hand? I'm not sure if Pratima's still there, but okay. Any other questions from anybody? Okay, right. So Peter, thank you for your presentation there. I'm sure everybody's learnt much. Do get in touch with Peter. I'm sure he's there and available to answer any questions that you'll have.
And I would encourage anybody that wants to apply is probably to ring rather than fill out the EIO. I mean, because it's much easier to discuss something over the telephone than look at some piece of paper. So it's much easier. So if you are thinking whether for next year, you know, or in the next 3 funding rounds, it's much better to talk it through. And the joy of going back to maybe a paper application is that I can actually show you the application and tell you what you need to put in the relevant boxes, which is something that we lost when it was an online form. So, you know, it makes it a lot easier to actually inform people how and why and what the process is.
Okay. Right, well, thanks very much. And do remember to fill in the questionnaire. There is a £25 incentive, a gift card to throw into that to encourage you, and to be available to be able to get that, you need to include your email in the form. We will be uploading this to the Northants Council website, and also the slides as well. So you'll be able to go in and reference those for future use. Okay, Corella, thank you for hosting us. I think we're done for now, and maybe see you again. Okay. Cheerio, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
And thank you, Peter.